Time for supper, little ones. Help yourselves. Roar. Whoa, she's here. And GT, the first alien orphan to taste my cooking, spatted across the room and then asked for seconds. That single moment 3 years ago is the reason a war fleet carrying the most feared matriarch in the galaxy is now parked in low orbit above my farmhouse. And the reason she is not currently melting my house into slag is entirely because of what I fed her children every single day while she was gone. Here is what you are about to learn. You will learn how a broke, half-disabled vet ended up running a daycare for the abandoned Larry of a species that humanity had only ever seen through gun sights. You will learn what actually happened during the long silence when the Kree war fleet vanished and left 40 orphans behind on a dying refugee station with nobody but one human and a rice cooker standing between them and starvation. And you will learn exactly what the Queen Mother said when she finally walked through my door expecting to find bones and found something else entirely. My name is Dale Hall, and before any of this I was nobody special. I did tour mopping up after the Kree border skirmishes, lost half the feeling in my left leg to a plasma fragment, and got shipped home with a pension that covered rent and not much else. The war ended in a stalemate nobody was proud of, which in galactic terms means everybody just got tired of dying. Part of the peace treaty, the part nobody on Earth paid attention to, was that the Kree would be allowed to establish a small refugee way station, the asteroid belt past Mars, a temporary home for civilians displaced by their own civil war. Nobody wanted that contract. The pay was garbage, the politics were radioactive, and most humans who'd fought in that war wanted nothing to do with the species that had taken their friends. I took the contract anyway because I needed the credits and because frankly I didn't have a lot of friends left to lose. The job was supposed to be logistics. Move supply crates, log inventory, keep the lights on in a station that smelled like ozone, and regret. Nobody mentioned that the station's nursery wing, the one holding 41 CFT larvae whose parents were dead or fighting, had lost its last caretaker to a transfer 3 weeks before I arrived. Nobody mentioned it because nobody on the station administration wanted to deal with it. I found out the way you find out about most disasters in this line of work, by walking into a room and immediately wishing I hadn't. They were small. That's the first thing that hits you. How small CFT children actually are compared to the 7FT armored warriors humanity had been shooting at for 6 years. Chitinous multilimbed eyes like black marbles, and silent in a way that no human child is ever silent. They weren't crying because crying for Kree is a sound reserved for true desperation, the kind you make when you've already accepted nobody is coming. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Then I went and found out what the hell they were supposed to eat. That's the part of this story most people skip, but it's the part that actually mattered. So let's slow down here. Kree biology runs on a completely different nutritional baseline than ours, heavy in sulfur compounds and certain rare earth trace minerals that Earth produce simply doesn't carry naturally. The station had emergency ration paste for adult, creationally engineered and about as appetizing as wet cardboard, and the kids hated it. Not picky eater, hated it, actively gagging, refusing to open mandibles. Hated it to the point where 3 of the Smallest ones were already showing signs of malnutrition by the time I found them. I'm not a chef. I am not a nutritionist. I'm a guy who used to make a decent chili for his platoon and had absolutely no business solving an alien dietary crisis, but there was nobody else in the room, so I started cooking. The first month was trial and disaster in roughly equal measure. I burned through the station's entire spice inventory trying to find anything that would make the ration pace palatable without violating their biology. I cross-referenced agricultural records from the Peace Treaty archives. At 2 in the morning, hunting for crops their species actually farmed back home, I found a sulfur-rich tuber called vask root that grew in a hydroponics bay nobody had touched in years. Roasted it, mashed it, mixed it with the paste, and put it in front of the kid who'd spat at me. He stared at it, he ate it then. And I will never forget this as long as I live. He held out his bowl with both little claws and made a sound the station translator rendered as one word: more. I want you to understand what that meant, because it's the hinge this entire story swings on. Cree orphans on that station had been fed and watered and kept alive, technically for weeks. Nobody had fed them food they actually wanted to eat. There's a difference between surviving and being cared for. And somewhere around the 3rd week of burnt tubers and stubborn experimentation, 41 alien children figured out which one I was offering. It wasn't just the vast root either, though that's the part that ended up in the archives. I spent nights going through old Cree botanical surveys, looking for anything else their species had farmed before the war scattered their supply lines, and I found references to a fermented grain paste their elders used to make for festivals, something closer to a treat than a staple. I had no festival-grade ingredients and no idea what I was doing, but I had a hydroponics bay, patience, and 41 reasons to figure it out. The first batch was inedible. The second batch made one of the older kids, a sharpie troublemaker named Core, actually laugh, a sound the translator didn't even have a clean word for, because apparently young Cree don't laugh often enough for the system to have logged it well. I started keeping a notebook after that, not a recipe book. Not really, more like a record of 41 small victories, one column at a time. Word travels strange in small stations. Within 2 months, I wasn't just covering meals, I was the only adult most of those kids would let touch them without flinching. I learned which ones liked their vask root crispy and which ones wanted it soft. I learned that the littlest one, a runt, the others called Skitter because translators are bad at names, refused to eat unless someone sat next to her, so I sat next to her every meal for the better part of a year. I learned 41 names, 41 preferences, 41 tiny personalities that the rest of the galaxy had written off as collateral damage in someone else's war. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just the only guy who showed up to the kitchen every single day, and it turns out that's most of what heroism actually is. Then the message came through and everything on that station changed at once. The Cree War fleet, the one that had been holding the line against a splinter faction 3 systems over, had gone dark. Not destroyed, dark, which in military terms is so much worse because nobody knew which. Among the ships in that fleet was the flagship of Matriarch Vesser Cree, Supreme War Mother of the Cree Dominion, and not incidentally biological or adoptive mother to 19 of the 41 children currently living in my care. Station command got nervous, half the human administrative staff started talking. Evacuation because an unguarded Cree nursery sitting in human territory with no fleet to answer for. It was the kind of geopolitical landmine that gets careers and possibly lives ended. I didn't care about any of that. I cared that 19 kids were about to be told their mother might be dead and that the other 22 were watching their faces to see how scared they should be. So I didn't tell them anything was wrong. I made dinner. I made the good dinner, the one with crispy vask root and the seared protein cake liked. And I sat at the long table with all 41 of them like it was any other Tuesday. And I let the routine do the talking. Kids, even alien ones with mandibles and exoskeletons, read adults better than adults read each other. If I was calm, they could be calm. So I was calm, even though I spent every night after they were asleep staring at a dead comms channel, waiting for news that didn't come for 6 months. 6 months. That's the part people always want me to skip over when I tell this story, and that's exactly why I won't. 6 months of no fleet, no funding renewal because the budget had technically lapsed with the silence, and no backup because every able human administrator on that station found a reason to transfer out the moment the political risk got real. I stayed. I drained my own veteran's pension into keeping the hydroponics bay running. I traded favors with a cargo hauler named Ray's who started smuggling in real produce instead of paste because he'd seen Skitter's face once, and apparently that was enough for him too. I taught the older kids, the ones pushing toward what would be CF adolescence, how to cook for the younger ones, because if something happened to me, there needed to be somebody left who knew how. There was a night somewhere around month 4 when the station's reactor hiccuped, and we lost heating for 9 hours. And I remember sitting on the cold floor of the nursery wing with Skitter wrapped in a blanket meant for a human twice her size, and Core and 2 of the other older kids standing watch over the younger ones, like junior officers who'd appointed themselves without being asked. Nobody panicked. I'd like to say that was because of something wise I did, but honestly, I think it was because by that point they trusted the routine more than they trusted any single adult, including me, and the routine said, dinner happens, bedtime happens. Somebody is here. That's a strange kind of legacy, too. Accidentally build, but I'll take it. 41 kids became in every way that matters, except blood, the only family I had left. I am not going to pretend that's a clean, simple thing to say. It's just true. Word of what was happening on that little way station eventually crawled its way through human channels the way these things do, and it did not land well at first. There were op-eds, there were furious calls into local stations asking why a war veteran was, in their words, raising the enemy's children on the taxpayer's old pension. I got hate mail from people who'd never set foot off Earth, accusing me of treason, of Stockholm Syndrome, of being a traitor to my own dead friends. There was one message I still remember almost word for word from a man who said he'd lost a brother in the same border skirmish that took the feeling out of my Leg asking how I could possibly look at those kids and not see the war. I didn't have a clean answer for him then, and I'm not sure I have one now, except that the kids in that nursery hadn't fought. Anybody hadn't chosen anything, and somebody still had to feed them while the adults argued about whose grief mattered more. I read maybe 3 of those messages before I stopped because none of the people writing them had ever sat across a table from a kid named Skitter and watched her learn to trust that food would show up tomorrow. You can't argue someone out of a feeling like that, and I stopped trying. I just kept cooking. The day the fleet came back, I was in the kitchen. Of course I was elbowed deep in vast root paste, prepping for dinner, half listening to the kids running drills in the next room because the older ones had taken it upon themselves to keep the little ones busy. The whole station's alert system screamed at once. 41 massive Kree warships dropped out of slip space directly above the way station. Scarred, battle-worn, half of them venting atmosphere from damage that told its own story about where they'd been for 6 months. And at the center of that formation, the largest ship in the entire Kree Dominion, the flagship of Matriarch Vesa Kree herself, alive against every reasonable bet anyone had placed. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't relief. Not at first. It was terror, the specific kind of terror you get when the most powerful individual in known space is about to descend on the room where you've been raising her children and judge in real time whether you did it right or whether you failed. I had exactly the time it took her shuttle to dock to decide what to do, and what I decided was nothing different. I played a dinner. I called the kids to the table. The room smelled like roasted Vask root and seared protein cake, same as every other Tuesday, and somewhere in the back of my head, a voice that sounded a lot like my old drill sergeant was telling me that panicking now would undo 6 months of work in about 30 seconds, so I didn't panic. I was setting down a bowl of crispy Vass root in front of Skitter when the kitchen door opened and 7 FT of battle-armored Kree matriarch walked in, flanked by guards with weapons that could have turned the whole station to vapor, and stopped dead in the doorway. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her children, all 41 of them, sitting at a long table, healthy, loud, arguing over who got the last protein cake the way siblings do, none of them flinching, none of them silent in that desperate way I'd found them in all those months ago. I watched her eyes move down the table, kid by kid, like she was doing a count she'd done 1,000 times before in worse circumstances, confirming with her own eyes what the reports couldn't quite convince her of. Skitter looked up, saw her, and didn't scream or cry. She held up her bowl with both claws, the same gesture she'd made to me on day 1, and said one word through the translator: more. The matriarchs guards tensed, weapons half raised, waiting for a single word from her to turn this kitchen into a crater. Vaser Kreth said nothing for 11 full seconds. 11 seconds is a very long time to stand in a doorway with your soldiers' fingers on their triggers and your entire future resting on what a war mother decides to do next. Then she walked past every armed soldier in that room, knelt down at a child-sized chair that was absolutely not built for someone her size, and asked me in halting, careful standard if there was enough for one more. That's the part of the story nobody saw coming, including me. I braced for judgment, for an inspection, maybe for a court-martial, and everything but name. What I got instead was the Supreme War, mother of an entire alien dominion, sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor, because the chairs didn't fit her, eating reheated vast root paste out of a chipped bowl while 19 of her biological children climbed over her armor like she'd never left. She didn't ask me why I'd done it. She'd already watched the answer walk across the room and ask for seconds. What happened after is the part you've probably already heard pieces of, because it made the news whether I wanted it to or not. Vesra Kreth did not destroy the station, did not file a single complaint about how her children had been raised by a human she'd never met, and did not, despite what half of Earth's media predicted, demand reparations or an apology. She did something nobody on either side expected. She asked me to stay on as the nursery's official caretaker with full CRT Dominion backing, full funding, and a formal diplomatic designation that effectively made me the first human ever granted standing within the internal structure of the Kree military command. There were closed-door meetings on both sides for weeks after that, human officials nervous about precedent, Kree officers nervous about a human holding any title inside their command structure at all. And from what I heard, Vesra Kreth ended most of those meetings the same way, by asking everyone in the room a single question: who else fed her children for 6 months? While the rest of the galaxy argued about politics, nobody had an answer to that, so the title stuck. The same op-ed writers who'd called me a traitor 6 months earlier had to publish corrections about the human who just become, in practical terms, a senior figure in alien child care policy. I didn't do it for the title. I did it because Skitter still wanted someone sitting next to her at every meal, and some promises don't come with an expiration date just because the political situation changes. The way station isn't temporary anymore, it's a permanent joint facility, now staffed by a mixed human Kree. And the recipe for that first crispy Vask root dish, the one that made a starving orphan ask for more, is apparently now an official item in the Dominion's cultural archive, credited to a guy who just wanted to make dinner for some kids nobody else would feed. Cora is training to be a fleet logistics officer now, of all things, and tells anyone who will listen that he learned discipline standing watch over sleeping toddlers during a blackout, which is probably truer than half the leadership lessons taught at any academy. Skitter's 17 now, in cry years, training to be a nursery caretaker herself, and she still makes me sit next to her at the table every time she visits, like nothing about that habit ever needs to change. Vesro Kreth and I are not exactly friends. You don't get friendship with a war mother who's seen 6 months of slip space combat. But we are something rarer between our two species, which is simply trusted. She trusted me with the only thing she couldn't protect herself, and I am never going to treat that lightly. If this story hit you somewhere, if you want more of these human against impossible odds found family in deep space stories, hit subscribe and check the next video linked on screen, because this is far from the strangest thing that happened on that station, and I've got a lot more to tell.